Chapter 6 Escape from Hurtsville. July 9th, Hurtsville Metro Penal Colony, 12:22 a.m. Auren approached the trio and spoke. We truly appreciate your standing with us. We find ourselves indebted to you. If there is any way we can help you in the future, do let us know. Connor placed one hand on his chest and outstretched the other, bending at the waist into a respectful bow, lowering his eyes slightly. It was our sincerest pleasure. From behind, one could hear Jonas mumbling, I wouldn't go that far. Ilsai spoke with eloquence and gratitude. We've a gift for you, Jonas inquired. A gift? Tolvin spoke, continuing the message Ilsai had started. I understand that you do indeed plan to traverse the tunnels underneath the city, where your horseless carriage will not fit. I believe horseless bicycles can. Rolf's eyes opened wide at this. Horseless bikes? Ilsai responded, Yes, made by your famous Shirley Davison, I believe. Though their construction differs slightly from those typical of the manufacturer, as they have been modified. Jonas, trading glances with Rolf and looking back at Ilsai, blurted out, Where? Ilsai gave a nod to Tolvin, who said, Follow me. Connor gave a respectful and proper bow once again. We thank you. With that, the trio followed Tolvin to a warehouse type of building within the pumping station compound. Upon Tolvin lifting the massive garage-style door, 4 custom motorcycles were revealed. Tolvin spoke. Those who occupied the structure before us took most of these with them, but these 4 were left behind. Rolf chose the bike with the largest engine and the fewest accessories. Connor chose the bike with the long front fork and very wide rear tire. Jonas chose the bike with leather saddlebags, a windshield, and a radio. No one chose the electric one. As the trio went about getting acquainted with their new toys, Auren approached and addressed them as 3 members of the Order drew closer from behind him. We've one final thing to bestow upon you before you leave. Because you have acted in our defense, despite our shame, we consider you as equals in spirit. To show that appreciation, we wish to grant you these ceremonial swords as honorary members of our family. 3 members of the Order stepped forward, each offering a cruciform arming sword made of mithril, a superior alloy not native to Earth. Each sword was presented in a deep blue scabbard with gold trim at the ends. Each of the trio members respectfully bowed their heads and received the offering. With a final nod, Connor spoke. We thank you again. We must depart. Rolf opened his trench coat and secured the scabbard to an internal strap. Jonas slung the strap over his shoulder, mounting the scabbard to his back. Connor secured his sword to his belt on his right side. They started the bikes, each roaring to life and then idling roughly. After a few revs, they rode the bikes out the garage door, past a few buildings, and to a narrow ramp, leading down into the sewerways and abandoned subway tunnels. They would have to follow the underground river to its exit, where it empties into the ocean. To get to and follow the underground river, they would need to navigate several tunnels. Once at the rendezvous point, they were to make contact with an agent on a boat. Looking at the updated information, Rolf commented with delight, Good old Officer Dredge, always a step ahead in every situation. Jonas and Connor nodded in agreement. The 3 rode the bike zealously down into the tunnels, barely making contact with the ramp. Once in the tunnels, they activated their phones and set coordinates, which would feed them directions from their own Matic network. Equipped with cyberblock technology, these phones are immune to being hacked by government entities. Officer Dredge had sent updated maps of the area and new coordinates, and was notoriously reliable as a mission coordinator. Once in the tunnels, they put their headlights on and made their way through the narrow passages, occupied with rats, bats, and reptiles. The tunnels were dark, dank, and full of filth. They could ride through the narrow tunnels in a single-file formation, with Connor at the lead and Jonas taking up the rear. The skeletal remains of rats and humanoids littered the gutters on either side of the path. They would travel narrow tunnels with gutters which would which would later converge with open waterways, above which were many suspended bridges. At times they could ride fast down empty passages, while at others they would need to slow down as they rode through waters nearly a foot deep. After traversing several sewer tunnels, they would then enter the remnants of the abandoned subway tunnels, which would have to be followed to a second set of sewer tunnels, and then finally a pipeline that exits to the ocean. As they entered an old subway tunnel, Connor brought his bike to a stop, signaling the others to do the same. Once they all stopped, Connor spoke in a semi-hushed tone. "Listen." In the distance, echoing through the tunnels, Rolf and Jonas could scarcely make out the sound of many motorcycles. Connor contorted his face with intense focus. "We are being followed." Rolf nodded. "Let's stay in touch and coordinate on the earpieces." Using their phones, they activated the Matic earpieces, which are integrated directly into their ears. They resumed going down the subway tunnel, passing an abandoned train. Other motorcycles started to become visible in the rearview mirrors, but without riders. Rolf shouted, "We got pricks!" Connor reached down to his belt, calling out, "Use the swords!" Jonas inquired, "Swords?" Connor answered, "Swords of the Order are blessed with divine prayer rituals, and will be most effective." Rolf shouted louder over both of them, "Gotcha! Let's kill some pricks!" With that having been said, the trio drew their order swords, ready to use them as the vampires on motorcycles started to speed up and gain ground. They returned the riding in the direction of their original destination, with swords drawn. Vampires in leather jackets accelerated their approach from behind, wielding knives, chains, and spiked clubs. The trio raced through the tunnels at breakneck speeds. Rolf took an up-ramp onto a higher ledge. Jonas went through the open door of an abandoned train, going right down the middle of the rows of seats, while Connor stuck to the middle of the three sets of train tracks. An aggressive vampire approached Connor's bike from behind, wielding a chain, whirling it around as he crept closer on his own bike. As the vampire gangster approached from Connor's right rear, hoping to land a hit with his chain, Connor kept his head and blade low until the last moment. Sitting up with a flick of his wrist and raising his right arm, he intercepted the whirling chain with his sword, then yanked it forward, pulling it from the enemy's grasp. With a second flick of his arm, Connor flung the chain downward, where it got caught up in the motorcycle's front wheel, also wrapping around the front spokes, causing the front wheel to lock up. The bike skidded into a crash, throwing the vampire off into a pool of raw sewage. A vampire gangster pursued Rolf up the ramp onto the maintenance path, intending to smash him with his spiked club. As the enemy biker got closer, to within a few feet, Rolf suddenly let up off the throttle and squeezed the brakes, drastically slowing his speed quickly. As he did so, he swung the sword outward in an arc, catching the vampire in the midsection, causing a deep cut. Its flesh sizzled upon being cut by the blade, and it fell back from its bike, shrieking just as Rolf squeezed the accelerator, avoiding the tipping bike. As Jonas rode his bike through a very long chain of train cars, one of the vampire bikers remained in pursuit, gaining ground. Looking backward, Jonas resheathed his sword as the vampire came to within a few dozen feet or so. Jonas reached down to his right boot, narrowly ducking under a low-hanging ceiling that took off the top of the windshield, and before coming back up, removed a short cylindrical object from under his pant leg. He held the object over his shoulder, facing front to rear. With the press of one of the three buttons, the cylinder telescoped out into a 10-foot-long metallic pole, the end of which hit the enemy rider square in the forehead, knocking him straight off the back of his motorcycle. Jonas pressed another button, returning the pole to its original shortest length. He put the pole away and sheathed the sword once again. Within a few seconds, he was clear of the long set of trains and back on the central path near Connor. Rolf continued to ride a higher path, keeping a lookout for things ahead. Other bikes started to pour in from adjacent tunnels. Some of these were vampires, but most were their thralls, willingly bound servants, hoping to taste of the powers that vampiric blood can offer. The trio converged together, taking up a reverse triangle formation, with Connor at the rear, Rolf to the left, and Jonas to the right. They kept up as much speed as the tunnels allowed for. and some few riders behind him did lose control and crashed or backed off. The rest they would have to fight. Enemy bikers came in from various angles, and a melee ensued. The sounds of roaring engines, whirling weapons, and clashing steel rung throughout the tunnels. The trio fought valiantly and stoically, like Ronin riding upon mounts of iron and rubber. One of the trio members would be pressed when another member would cover their back or assist them from a flank. They worked in unison like a well-greased set of gears, grinding up anything caught between them like a tag team of 3. 1, 2, 4, then 8 foes fell. The swords, chains, clubs, knives, and even pistols of the enemy entered the fray. Connor and Jonas fought with the blade, while Rolf provided cover and interference with his sawn-off, cartridge-fed semi-automatic shotgun, which could fire up to 30 shots between reloads. After defeating a few more than 30 opponents, the remaining 16 gave up their pursuit. Some simply backed off, while others turned around and fled at full speed. A few minutes later, they left the train tunnels and found themselves in the sewers once again. These paths were all familiar to them, as they had used them several times before, but still complex enough to require navigational assistance. Thankfully, Officer Fledge's maps were incredibly accurate. Their route took them into a wide tunnel with deeper grooves on either side, meant to channel the flow of wastewater. Despite this, the water in the tunnel was nearly a foot deep, causing the trio to slow their bikes to under 20 miles per hour. The water itself not only contained human waste, but was also littered with the physical remains of partial corpses, mostly of rats, but also some humanoids. After a long, slight bend in the tunnel, and navigating a few hundred feet of feces and animal remains, they arrived upon a massive pile of humanoid corpses, all in various states of decomposition. Above the pile was a long vertical shaft. This was the method by which the prison authorities would dispose of the bodies of those who died or were nearly dead from participating in competition for resources. If one couldn't get out on their own 2 feet, they were typically tossed down the hole. The pile of corpses was as wide as the tunnel, a little over 30 feet, and a little over 20 feet tall. Despite having seen this type of thing before, it was never not shocking to see, for any of them. Having brought their bikes to a stop in order to consider how they might navigate around the pile of corpses, Jonas mumbled, "God help me." Rolf stared in awe and disgust at the pile of corpses, while Connor's ears twitched about. They turned off their bikes and dismounted, looking for some way to clear the tunnel. Seemingly from everywhere in the tunnel, a booming voice echoed all throughout. "There are no gods down here. Only death." A vague form could be seen above the corpse pile in the faint light emanating from the inside of the building on the surface level. The dim light illuminated the shadowy form of a somewhat large humanoid, arms crossed, with a more than 20-foot wingspan. It hovered but a few feet above the corpses, emanating a field that distorted the light around it and causing anyone near it to experience a sensation of chilling cold. Rolf, partially in disgust and partially in terror, exclaimed, "What in the literal fuck is this bullshit?" Connor spoke. "A corrupted Seraphite," Jonas inquired, somewhat jittery. "Corrupt Seraphite?" Connor answered. "A celestial being which has made a pact with a fallen angel in order to gain more power." Rolf made a sneering face. "So, it's a demon's butt boy." The voice boomed again. "That knowledge will not save you. Rise, my children, and dance. Dance and kill, that I may feast and inherit their bones and power. For life is in the marrow, and all bones shall become dust." Agitated and horrified, Rolf fired several shots from his sawn-off gun, which seemed to have no effect whatsoever, as the projectiles passed through the form as though it were a projection. Connor spoke in an urgent tone. "Swords! Only divine or magical properties can harm this." The imposing figure of the corrupted Seraphite lifted its arms and made an ominous sound, like a deep exhale, amplified in volume and twisted downward in pitch, halfway between an exhale and a dragon roar. A pillar of darkness came down upon the figure, seeming to absorb it down to the pile of corpses. The bodies started to convulse, twitch, and move of their own accord. They rose up and floated one after another. Half of them took on the form of a spherical mass of bodies, while the rest went into a fast orbit around the mass, about 20 feet in diameter. As this started to transpire, Connor performed a simple spell, created a hovering orb, which cast the equivalent of candlelight in a 60-foot area. Being that the sphere of corpses was hovering about 15 feet in the air, Rolf shot at it several times, only for the damage caused to heal up again within just a few seconds. Simultaneously, for each shot, a corpse fell to the ground, but then started to move on its own. Meanwhile, the orbiting corpses slowed down to a stop. Their mouths opened, spraying some kind of black mist that, when it came in contact with living tissue, caused a burning sensation as the flesh became diseased. Rolf and Jonas covered up the best they could and kept their eyes closed, but took on some cellular damage and endured the pain, wincing. Rolf, in pain but also enraged, shouted, "Let the bodies hit the floor! Let the bodies hit the floor! Let the bodies hit the floor!" Rolf did this while blasting at the bodies with a sawn-off shotgun, severing arms, legs, and heads. Those that lost heads fell to the ground and started to wither, giving up wisps of black vapor while releasing a death rattle. They soon started moving again, and in even faster orbit. Jonas used his sword to deal the animated corpses coming at them. The blessed blade was highly effective, and even set some of the corpses on fire when the strike landed just so. Connor resorted to flinging magically enchanted shuriken, which he produced piles of, a dozen at a time, from an inner coat pocket. With extreme precision, he could sever the head of an orbiting corpse. With but 2 or 3 strikes, using the burst of vampiric speed, he could toss out as many as 8 shurikens per second. A quartet of spiky tendrils started to form from the floating spherical mass of bodies, dripping with black goo. They made a squishy, slurping sound with every movement, each protruding in a separate direction. They suddenly lashed outward, growing in length as they struck out. Distracted by the orbiting corpses, Rolf was struck in the back, being knocked face first into the putrid water. Jonas narrowly avoided a second tendril with a well-timed dodge. The other 2 tendrils lashed out at Connor. With a well-timed slash, Connor severed one of the tendrils, but the other managed to wrap around his neck and lifted him off the ground. Connor strained but could not transform himself while in the grasp of the tendril, which prevented him from doing so. With a burst of movement, Jonas reached into the water, lifting up Rolf by the back of his collar, lifting his head just high enough for Rolf to spit out some water and regain his composure. Then, seeing Connor was in trouble, Jonas made a running leap at the tendril with his sword and managed to sever it, freeing Connor from its grasp. The orbiting bodies came to a halt again, and this time the chest of each burst open, firing bloody, thorny projectiles. Having just freed Connor, Jonas did not see them coming and was struck by a few of them, though not in any lethal area. Making a split-second decision, Connor dodged several, but stood between the thorns and Rolf, with his arm up, using one half of his cloak to cover himself as he wrapped it loose with a single flick of his arm, while also using the open dimension inside to cover for Rolf, sending several of the thorns into the dimension inside his celestial cloak of storing. Connor was not hurt, and Rolf had been protected, but Jonas started to feel the effects of the toxin, which was now running through his veins. Jonas started gasping and coughing, and dropped to one knee, holding on to his closing throat. Reaching into his leather jacket, Jonas produced a syringe and jabbed it into his own shoulder. The bodies again went into orbit around the fleshy sphere. Jonas' throat started to open again, allowing him to recover, and Rolf got back to his feet, still a bit woozy from the previous blow. Standing near to his allies, Connor reached into his pockets, producing a candle in a deep bowl. He lit the candle and set it upon the water, then, also producing a small vial of liquid, while chanting, popped the cork off the vial and dumped the contents onto the candle. With a flash, the oil was combusted, and a wave of red light went out from the candle in its circumference, followed by an expanding flash of blue flame. The wave of flames struck the ring of orbiting corpses just as they were slowing to act again. All in the ring were set aflame, and a good majority of them fell to the floor below, as the water had been receding and the central mass of body was growing in size. The remainder of the orbiting bodies fell to the floor as the swollen mass of flesh continued to grow in size, pulsating and making slurping sounds in the rhythm of a heartbeat. As it gathered mass, it started to form dozens more tendrils, began sprouting black thorns, and seeped acidic black goo, dripping in gallon-sized drops, which caused the floor to burn. Horrified, Jonas reached under his shirt and produced a crucifix, which he clung to tightly and started to chant an exorcism passage in Latin. Connor raised an eyebrow at this, while Ralph seemed much more impressed. Seemingly in an act of utter revulsion, the growing mass of flesh lashed out at everything nearby, using its thorny tendrils. Having seen that Jonas was effectively uttering a holy prayer, and that it was having some sort of effect, Connor provided physical defense as best as he could, taking several hits from the multiple tendrils, and eventually fell to the floor upon his knees. Rolf switched to a different gun from within his jacket. This one is a pump-action shotgun, loaded with dragon's breath-laden ammo. He fired at the spherical mass repeatedly, causing bodies to fall off and animate, then aiming at the bodies as they started to move, blowing them to bits and setting them on fire, as well as portions of the swollen mass. As Jonas continued to recite the prayer, the swollen, pulsating mass seemed to cave in on itself, as though being strangled by an invisible ring, dripping with black sludge. It contorted and twisted just before sending out a wave of water, black goo, and shredded remains in every direction in a massive explosion. Despite being on his knees and bleeding from more than a dozen places, Connor raised his arms, holding his cloak high, and stood just before the others, taking the brunt of the damage. Connor would have fallen to the floor had Rolf and Jonas not rushed ahead, holding on to either arm, keeping him on his feet. Within a few seconds, Connor started to regenerate from most of the injuries, and was able to stand on his own feet again. With the field of bodies dispersed, the shadowy figure was ejected and had to take its original form again. It floated, still ominous and obscured, with its arms crossed again, several feet above the newly formed river of sludge and body parts that the trio was now standing knee-deep in. Seeing a potential opportunity to strike, Connor reached for the sword on the floor, stood, then ran to make a leaping swing at the corrupted Seraphite. Getting close, he found himself repelled and shocked by some unseen force of energy. Connor was knocked to the floor and had to regain his footing. Rolf and Jonas both retained their order swords. Rolf re-equipped, in his right hand, the sawn-off shotgun with the cartridge ammo, which could be wielded with one hand thanks to Matic technology that reduced the recoil of the weapon to nearly nothing. The Seraphite extended its arms again, pulling bones and chunks of brick from out of the water. The material accumulated around the Seraphite's spectral form, taking on the form of a humanoid golem made of bones, brick, steel, and concrete. A flash of black light made everything in the area appear as spectral, which distorted the shimmering edges. After the momentary flash, what stood before the trio was an armored, 7-foot-tall humanoid with a skeletal face, holding a 12-foot-long scythe. Black goo dripped from the shape, forming a ragged black robe of suspended liquid material. Around this figure hovered 6 sickles, each spinning at a vicious rate of speed. Rolf and Jonas, both seasoned members of the force, bore faces that displayed looks of shock or disbelief and fear. Connor encouraged in a low voice. "Keep sharp," Jonas exclaimed. "I like sharp things." Rolf taunted, saying, "Bring it on, devil boy." The 6 sickles went flying out at their targets. Connor was able to perform a tuck and roll, avoiding 2. Rolf ducked under one and deflected the second with his sword of the order. Jonas leapt over one aimed at his legs, and was nearly struck by the second as it flew overhead, taking a small piece of his jacket. The sickles then boomeranged back, 2 missing Connor, 2 missing Jonas, 1 missing Rolf, and 1 nicking his side, penetrating his vest, causing a bleeding wound. As the sickles were being dealt with, the Seraphite, still floating with the large scythe held high, charged straight for Rolf, who was recovering from a slightly prone position after being struck. Rolf deflected the charging blow with his sword, but was knocked onto his backside by the force of the blow, while Connor stepped backward, also having been within the arc of the scythe. Connor and Jonas both managed to land glancing blows with their swords as the creature charged through, while Rolf also landed a gun blast as he fell. The blows caused some minor damage to the armor under the goop, causing some material to fall to the floor, but also causing some of the black liquid to splash out, hitting the floor and some portion of their clothes, acting as an acid upon whatever it struck. The sword blades were singed but not significantly damaged, and only because they were mithril. The sickles, having returned to their original position, flew back out again. This time all six flew out at Rolf. Within that instant, Connor was able to rend a pre-charged psionic burst of force, deflecting the sickles around a force field that lasted for but a second. On the return trip, one sliced Jonas' shoulder mid-dodge, and another split Rolf's gun into two pieces, destroying it. The other blades went straight at Connor, who dodged two, but was struck by two, one in the abdomen and the other in the chest. A split moment after each strike, each sickle tore itself free on the return trip to its original position. The Seraphite charged directly at Connor, who managed to blink out of the way using magic, appearing 10 feet from his previous position. In a frustrated huff, Rolf detached the ammo cartridge and threw it at the Seraphite. The box of ammo became lodged in the liquid. Rolf pulled a high-caliber pistol and fired off several shots in a flurry, striking the ammo box and igniting much of the ammo inside, causing a fiery explosion. Chunks of bone, stone, and goop flew out, narrowly missing the trio as they dodged, but leaving a good-sized hole in the creature's chest. The Seraphite made a shrieking roar, and the room started to darken. During the brief downtime, Rolf produced a syringe from his jacket pocket and injected it into his shoulder, causing his wounds to rapidly heal. This medical technology was highly effective, but overuse, more than twice a day, could cause a long-term physiological problem. The sickles dropped to the floor as the Seraphite's armor, goop, and other materials dropped and oozed to the ground, revealing the being's true form. Before the trio stood a nearly 7-foot-tall humanoid that had silver skin, mottled with gray and black spots, yellow cat-like eyes, a protruded mouth with long canines on the upper jaw, 4 wings, and a 19-foot span comprised of singed bones and black feathers. It wore a toga-style garment and had braces and boots of some black metal with a bluish sheen. At the end of its fingers were sharp nails, nearly a foot long. The Seraphite had oversized shoulders, feet, and hands, and a very narrow waist. A spear-headed tail, nearly 20 feet long, adorned its backside. All the water and filthy materials around it were absorbed, having been originally part of its accumulated structure. The effect of the simple light spell was snuffed out in the creature's local vicinity for a few feet. He made 2 fists, holding them out in front of him with outstretched arms, and spoke in a voice that sounded like a combination of a serpent rattle and a breeze ripping through a valley, both hissing and rumbling. The room darkened completely, and the effects of gravity began to multiply rapidly, growing in just a few seconds to 6 times the normal effect. Rolf, who normally weighed a little over 220 pounds, would now find the gravity of his own mass multiplied by 6, bringing him to his knees and then his face, as his relative weight increased to over 1,500 pounds. Jonas, who normally weighed about 140 pounds, now collapsed to his knees under the weight of more than 800 pounds. Connor, however, remained on his feet, able to bear his new weight of a little under 800 pounds. Jonas labored to speak, saying, "Can't move. Too have." Rolf simply labored to breathe at all, stuck on his face on the floor. The Seraphite boomed out, "Feel the weight of your arrogance." While saying this, the Seraphite also reached up with its hands, immersing them into a void up to the wrist, then pulling a wicked-looking 2-handed black blade from the void. It was about 6 feet long, had a wide blade and guard, and the tip was like that of a double-bearded axe with a spiked point, like that of a halberd. It was such a deep black that it absorbed some of the light around it. Holding the sword in a ready position, it charged straight at Connor with an arcing sword swing that made the air around it whoosh in a deep tone. Connor dodged as best as he could, but under 6 times his normal weight, even he had slowed down some. Leaping backward, Connor found himself struck by the end of a second follow-up attack, taking a somewhat deep cut to the abdomen. Going into a burst of speed, he rushed forward as a counter, only for a Seraphite to sideswipe, causing Connor to miss entirely. The Seraphite's next attack came swiftly, forcing Connor to attempt a block rather than dodging. The Order Sword flew across the room from the impact, also knocking Connor to his back, skidding some 20 feet across the floor, even under the effects of the enhanced gravity, far out of reach of the sword. The gravity effect certainly seemed to have shifted the battle in the Seraphite's favor. Rolf and Jonas were still pinned helplessly to the floor. Seeing this, the Seraphite sprinted over to their position as Connor got to his feet, somewhat dazed from the previous blow. The Seraphite held its huge, wicked blade high above the two prone men, and then bellowed out in a boasting tone, "Fellow Celestial, I will show mercy upon you, if you will but choose. I offer you a trade, their lives for yours." Despite being struck by a demon blade, Connor, being half Arc Celestial and half Elven Vampire, unless staked, could fairly quickly regenerate from injuries caused by anything, save for divine properties or fire. With his large gash closing and the bleeding slowing, and regaining some of his balance and focus, Connor responded with furrowed brows and clenched teeth. "I choose to kill you." The Seraphite readied the blade, turning it to face the floor, and bellowed, "You have chosen poorly." The Seraphite started to move to bring down his blade. Before the movement could be completed, Connor blinked from his position to directly behind the Seraphite, appearing a few feet in the air, and landed in a mighty thrusting kick, hitting the Seraphite square in the back of the head before landing, sending the foe stumbling a few feet away. In anger, the Seraphite turned and lashed out with another blow, only for Connor to blink again, this time coming in from an angle with a brutal punch to the face, after which Connor slid along the ground on his feet, as though skateboarding without a board, stopping a few feet away. Quickly, Connor produced his two-handed Starlight Nodachi from within his cloak and readied himself for another attack. The Seraphite merely chuckled at his foe's resourcefulness, and with a flash of movement went straight at Connor with a mighty downward swing of his blade. Connor timed his blink to the last milliseconds and reappeared to the Seraphite's flank, landing a slashing strike with his Nodachi. Some black blood seeped from the wound, which did not regenerate quickly, having been struck by a celestial blade. The Seraphite had a sinister chuckle again, crossed its arms, and looked to produce multiple copies of itself throughout the room. It flapped its wings, hovered a few feet up along with all of its clones, and then one of them lunged in for an attack. Connor blocked it, only to discover it was an illusion, and was instead struck from his flank, taking a deep cut to his left shoulder. Connor lashed out at a nearby target for his blade to simply pass through. Following that, an attack came from Connor's other flank, which he attempted to dodge, only to be caught again, taking a nasty cut to the face. Connor lashed out at the target again, only to miss again and be cut across the chest, suffering a broken rib and a deep wound, gushing blood. By now, Connor had lost a lot of blood and was feeling a bit woozy, as even a vampire or a celestial would need to regenerate to regain lost blood. Typically, the wound would close first, then the blood would reconstitute next, as to the nature of most regenerative physiologies. Connor attempted another strike and missed, only to be struck by the side of the Seraphite's giant blade, striking him like a baseball bat. The blow sent him flying across the room and into a brick wall, knocking loose some of the bricks. Connor strained to stand, only to fall back onto one knee. The Nodachi was far away as well, as he had dropped it upon being struck. The Seraphite gloated. "So, this is the son of Vladimiros I have heard so many fables about. Ha ha ha! Pitiful! Have you any last words?" Connor, now on 2 knees and 2 hands, closed his eyes and took in a deep breath. Remembering his own words about illusion, he listened instead of looking, and all the shadow images vanished. He could hear the whole room, his friends gasping for air, and the true location of the Seraphite. The Seraphite came stomping over, shouting, "Well?" Still somewhat busted and very bloody, Connor lifted his head, but kept his eyes closed, and said, "Fuck you." As the Seraphite closed in for a final blow, Connor blinked away, reappearing directly on the Seraphite's shoulders. Before the foe could react, Connor held tight onto the neck and bore his fangs. He lunged in for a bite, sinking his teeth into the Seraphite's neck. The Seraphite dropped its sword in shock, protesting with a thunderous shout, flailing its arms about as Connor used his teeth to extract vital essence from the body. Having gotten a decent amount of blood quickly, Connor blinked out of the way, just as the Seraphite punched it where Connor had been, instead punching himself in the head. Connor had blinked back to where his sword had been knocked to, and had reclaimed it. Opening his eyes for only a moment, he revealed them to shine bright red, and opening his bloodied mouth, he let out a wailing roar that caused some of the ceiling to collapse from sheer vibration. He closed his eyes again and readied himself for combat, fully healed and enhanced by celestial and demonic blood. The Seraphite ran to reclaim his own blade, throwing illusional attacks that Connor did not respond to, only to be intercepted by Connor arriving to kick the blade across the floor. The Seraphite lashed out with a blow, but missed as Connor blinked again, this time cutting the corrupted Seraphite deeply from the flank. Over and over the Seraphite would attack, only to be evaded and countered. Connor made himself both the carrot and the stick, presenting himself as a target, only to blink away, and then coming in from some unorthodox angle. Slash after slash, Connor wore down his foe, until at last, after appearing behind his foe and creating a noise on purpose, blinked away again, only to appear and blink again, right in front of the target, expecting something to appear from behind. This distraction gave Connor enough time to blink away and rush forward with a mighty thrust, plunging the long starlight blade a couple of feet into the Seraphite's chest. Doing so ended the enhanced gravity effect, allowing Rolf and Jonas to finally take in some deep breaths. Still holding the blade in the Seraphite's chest with his right hand, he raised his left and presented his hand palm up. About 20 feet behind his foe, a black orb appeared, which flashed with blue and red electricity about it, creating a highly localized gravity well. The injured Seraphite grasped at the blade in his chest, but to no avail. Connor raised a foot and thrust a mighty kick into the creature's body, sending it off the end of the blade and into the dark orb. Free of the blade, the Seraphite tried to move, but was being pulled into the dark sphere. The Seraphite and any matter within 10 feet were sucked entirely into the orb, which started to fluctuate in size, pulsating and vibrating. Connor ran over to Jonas and Rolf and knelt to the floor, covering his allies with his cloak while also wrapping it around himself as shelter. Upon a few more pulses, the gravity orb suddenly reversed, expelling all the matter that had been within it. Blood, bones, and raw sewage had been absorbed, and chunks of other matter splattered out in every direction, coating the walls, floors, and ceiling in goop, blood, and debris. A black vapor cloud could be seen emanating from all around, coalescing and then vanishing from view. Connor, bloodied and covered in all manner of debris and filth, rose to his feet, lifting his cloak, so that Rolf and Jonas could recover. He helped them both to their feet as their breathing and their color returned to normal. A moment later, Connor's appearance and power levels returned to those normal to him. Rolf, standing up, still coated in grime, fished into a jacket pocket and took out a pack of Murite cigarettes, as well as a mechanical flint lighter. He lit up its smoke and took in a big drag. Meanwhile, Jonas was scraping off as much of the grime as he could. Connor stood a few feet off, eyes closed, taking in some deep breaths. When he turned around, he opened his eyes, which no longer glowed. He surveyed the area visually and with his hearing, verifying that no one else was following. The three were again standing in a foot of sewer water, littered with rotting body parts. Looking around, Rolf was dismayed to find that the motorcycles had been destroyed when the Seraphite had collected the materials around itself. He muttered, "Well, shit. I guess we're hoofing it the rest of the way. At least our go bag seemed to have survived." Jonas, looking at Connor, asked in a somewhat exasperated sounding tone, "What in the fuck was that?" Connor, regaining his composure, responded, somewhat flatly, "A Sarah..." Jonas interrupted, "Not that! The thing you did, with the glowing, all red eyes, and the orb." Before Connor could respond, Rolf put a hand on Connor's shoulder and said, "Connor is a special kind of prick. When he wigs out, he can use his extreme emotions to enhance his senses, and when he drinks the blood of a supernatural creature, he temporarily gains some of its abilities." Jonas answered, looking at the floor, "No shit, huh? But that thing enhanced gravity all around. It didn't compress it into a ball." Connor spoke this time, saying, "The ability I inherit will be subject to personal interpretation, making my version different." Jonas paused for a moment, then asked, "That's really powerful. How do you..." Rolf interjected, "Extreme emotions. The dead man here can only feel those under crazy circumstances." Jonas asked, "Like when you're afraid or angry?" Connor replied, his facial expression appearing to become even more emotionally distant, "I am always afraid or angry." Rolf walked over to Jonas, not even giving him the eye, and in a very low voice, almost a whisper, said, "When he was just a boy, his father did some stuff to his brain to control him. Now he can't feel the good emotions. Made him a better, more efficient killer." Connor cleared his throat to interrupt and spoke, "I believe I have been the topic of discussion for long enough. We should be moving." Connor resumed walking in the direction of the goal. Rolf let out a sigh, then took another drag from his cigarette. Exhaling with another sigh, he said to Jonas, "Yep, bad dads. We all got something in common." Jonas asked Rolf, "You too?" Taking another drag, Rolf continued, "Yeah, when I was 6, I watched my father drown my mom in a bathtub. You got your scar from your dad, but not all scars can be seen, right?" Exhaling the last of the smoke, Rolf said, "The General didn't pick us because we're the best. He picked us hoping we'd hold hands, sing Kumbaya, or swap spit in the shower, or whatever bullshit therapists want abused boys to do these days. Come on, we gotta move."